Yeah, it just I want to show you that this is a cardinal. This is the Virginia's national state bird. So
Oh, wow. Okay.
yeah, because I talk about China, so today is a little bit Virginian. So I
Okay.
live
Well,
in
why
Virginia.
not? Why not? Absolutely. Very
Yeah,
beautiful state. I've never been to it. So people tell me that.
yeah, and the cardinal is a beautiful bird. It's really red. The real one, the male is really bright
Oh,
red
all right.
and beautiful when you see them, on the tree.
All right.
And for that reason, it's many southern states state bird. It's not just Virginia, it's
Mm.
West
Oh,
Virginia, Indiana, Kentucky. They will have that as a state bird. So
oh
just so you
gosh.
know.
Okay. Cardinal, as in a Roman Catholic cardinal.
Yeah, yes, cardinal,
Okay.
yes.
That's because of course cardinals are robed in red. So anyway,
Yes.
there we
Yeah,
go.
maybe that's the reason. Yeah, I
Maybe
never
that's
thought
the
about it.
reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Gosh.
Okay. Gosh, another week. Another week. Crazy week.
Yeah.
All right. Let's start with Medvedev visit to
Yeah.
China. I send you the readout, right?
Yeah.
I don't learn much from it. What is your
No.
impression? What is he doing there? Clearly it's important, right?
It
But
is a
what
very important. It it is very important. The readout, but is extremely uninformative, and by the way, the Russians have failed to provide a detailed readout either.
Mhm.
But I'm going to suggest what I think it was all about, which is that Donald Trump has now been elected president of the United States. He is talking now about starting negotiations with the Russians on various topics. He's talking about starting negotiations to find some means to either end the war in Ukraine or at least to limit American involvement in it. And there's been an awful lot of discussion in the United States amongst Trump's people, including by Donald Trump himself. And I've heard Vivek Ramaswamy himself say this. I mean, he said this in a discussion program that I attended. I was a participant in, and he was there. And I've Elon Musk as well, that they've been talking about reopening dialogue with Russia in order to draw Russia away from China. They've been talking about this all of the time. So, what I think that the Russians want to do is that they've made it very clear that they are prepared to talk to Donald Trump. Putin is saying that he's prepared to meet with Donald Trump if Donald Trump wants to meet with him. But I think the Russians want to make it quite clear to the Chinese government, that in no way, under no circumstances, is any discussion with the United States going to change by 1 millimeter Russia's friendship to China. That is non-negotiable. So I think Medvedev went to Beijing. I don't think the Chinese had any doubts about this, but he's technically the number two in Russia. He's the deputy chair of the Security Council. He is the leader of the United Russia Party. He's been Russia's president. He's been Russia's prime minister. He's very, very close to Putin. I think he went to China to to say that personally to Xi Jinping himself, to
Mhm.
say, look, whatever happens between us and the Americans, it is not going to affect our relationship with you. And if you track the Russian media and Putin's own statements, public statements, you can see that that is the Russian position. They are aware of this debate that's going on in the Americans about how to pull Russia away from China. And they don't want the Chinese to have any worries or doubts that anything like that will happen.
Yeah, actually, in line with that, it's interesting you saying that because there is a lot of speculations about what happened to Syria, right?
Mm.
Why Assad government fell so
Yeah.
fast without much fight,
Mm. Mm.
without much resistance from Assad's military.
Mm.
So one of the theory I just heard, I find interesting, is it possible that Trump and Putin are having a deal so that Putin or Russia give up Syria? In return, Trump will find a solution for Ukraine that will to Russians satisfactory.
Mm.
And also possible. I mean, this theory goes even so far as saying Trump might even have a deal with Iran that, okay, you give up Syria, we're going to have a deal with you to stop the sanctions, stuff like that. Now, I doubt about the second part, but to have a deal with Russia giving up Syria and in return some solution that to Russia's satisfactory about Ukraine, I think it's plausible. I think it's plausible. What do you think?
I don't think so. And I'll say straight away why. I've had lots of contacts with people in Russia over the last couple of weeks. And the overwhelming impression I got was that, firstly, the Russians were shocked and taken
Mm-hmm.
by surprise by what happened in Syria. But secondly, when in late November, the offensive, the rebel offensive against the Syrian government began, the mood in Moscow was to do absolutely everything possible to support the Assad government. They were going to send more people to Syria. There was apparently special forces people on the way there. They were sending a whole team of drone operators. There was talk that they would even supply 10,000 specialized drones to be used against the rebels. So that all of these decisions, all of this was in motion.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened was that Aleppo fell, the Syrian, the second the biggest, actually it's the biggest city in Syria. Aleppo fell. The Russians were absolutely shocked by that. Putin has said that Aleppo was captured by 350 men, even whilst it was defended by 30,000 Syrian troops. That's what Putin said. And I think the Russians were profoundly shocked. And at that point, they suddenly realized that this regime that they had supported up to that time had become hollow, and that they weren't, that there was really no point in giving it any further resistance. So I don't think that there's been that kind of a deal done. I understand why people think that, but it's not something I've ever seen happen, frankly,
Mm-hmm.
um, between Russia and America, certainly since Putin became president. And I don't remember anything quite like this happening at any time during the Cold War either. I think it would be uncharacteristic of the Russians to do something like this. Bear in mind that they've been tricked by the Americans so many times. As Putin, by the way, complained in his press conference yesterday, that I just don't think that they would let themselves be tricked again by something like this. And as I said, the information I was getting from Moscow is that, on the contrary, they were all ready and set to go and to help Assad, and that they were shocked when everything fell apart instead.
Yeah, I find it's an interesting theory. I think it's
Mm,
possible, but my skepticism is what you're saying that why should the Russian trust the United States at this
mm,
point for anything, right?
mm,
Even, I mean, Putin said that. So let's say even Putin trusts Trump, but
mm,
Trump is only going to be there for
mm,
4 years. When, first of all, if the people around the Trump, what they are going to do and say, right?
mm.
Possibly there will be people probably sabotage the deal. Even Trump wants to. Secondly,
Correct.
when he's out of the office, then everything's off. We know that famous, Baker said we're not going to extend NATO beyond the East Germany. And then what happens, right?
Yeah.
So, and nobody even admit that ever happened. Lots of times people say, no, no, no,
Yeah.
they never promised that. So, in that sense, I agree with you. I think even they probably trust Trump. It just cannot work for them, right?
No, I agree. I mean, it's the kind of thing that Trump might suggest.
Yeah.
I don't really think the Russians would agree to that. I have to say, I mean, I think that the Russians generally when they enter into negotiations, they like to keep things separate. They don't like to, do a trade-off here in return for a trade for a thing something else there. I know the Chinese do that either, by the way. I mean, I get the sense that both Moscow and Beijing, in the way they conduct negotiations, deal, specifically with the problem at issue. And I think that the Russians, who pride themselves on standing by their friends, I mean, I don't think they would have done a deal like this behind Assad's back. The person that the Russians have been dealing with over Syria is Erdogan. Not because they trust him, because they don't. Russians do not trust Erdogan at all, but because they need a good relationship with Turkey. And over the last couple of days, week since Syria fell, you can see that they've had to deal with Erdogan and negotiate with him about, their bases in Syria, what is going to happen to them, about recognition for the current Syrian government, for those sort of things. And the reason they do that is because, as we've discussed before, Erdogan controls access to the Black Sea, which is very important. Turkey is an important trading partner. It's important for the Caucasus, for Central Asia. So the Russians feel that they have no choice but to grind their teeth and talk with Erdogan about Syria and accept the fact that he's won the game in Syria. But as I said, I don't think that they would deal with the Americans about Syria or with the Israelis or anyone else, frankly.
Yeah, and speaking of Turkey, actually, Trump's first press conference is very interesting. It's long, so there's a few things that I noticed. One thing, he actually made it very clear. He said one side collapsed, which is the Assad government, right? He said, who's behind the other side? Nobody's talking about that. I know, Turkey. So he actually put Turkey very prominently in this whole conflict, that made it very clear Turkey is the winner. He even said, okay, they won Syria for thousands of years, and now they got it. It's something like that. He's a smart man, what he meant is Erdogan, I guess.
Yes.
And so I wonder whether Trump's saying that to, I don't know whether he's doing that to cover what Israel's doing. So make Turkey very prominent, going, whatever going on in Syria, just pay attention to what Turkey is doing so that we can ignore what Israel's doing. Is that what Trump is doing here?
Yes, it is. It's partly what he is doing. He doesn't want to talk about Israel. He is fully supportive of Israel. He is quite plausibly knows that the Israelis are going to try and come after Iran next. He's not going to restrain them. He doesn't want to talk about Israel at all and the role Israel has played in all of this. There is, I think, another small factor which should not be overlooked, which is that Trump is also saying that the United States should stay out of Syria, that the people there are not friendly to the United States, and that the United States has no great interest in Syria. So he basically is saying to Erdogan, look, this is your mess or your achievement, whatever it is. You can look at, you can have it. I'm not really interested in any of this. Don't let this affect our relations. But at the same time, he's covering for Israel too. The way in which Trump handles Israel is going to be very important going forward. And it's his blind spot, in my opinion. It could get him into serious trouble if Israel now capitalizes on its success in Syria to escalate its plans and to start launching attacks on Iran. Then, as I said, Trump could find himself pulled back into the Middle East, which I sense he doesn't really want to do. But that remains to be seen.
Yeah. The other thing in his press conference, I mean, we'll go back to Turkey later. Okay. So the other thing he talked about is China. Now, there has been some rumors saying that they invited Xi Jinping to come to his inauguration, right? And then later, CBS is saying that Xi Jinping is not coming. And so people asked him about that. And he said, I don't know whether he's going to come. He hasn't said one way or the other. I find that's interesting.
So typical of Trump.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, when I read that, I thought, well, it only makes sense if this is not just Xi Jinping come to his inauguration. I very much doubt Xi Jinping would just come to his inauguration and then leave. I think it makes more sense if this is a real, like a state visit, that they really have some deal going on and maybe even possibly sign some deal. So the first day would be the inauguration and then followed with some other events or something. I think only that makes sense. But now it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. Seems like according to CBS. But according to Trump, Xi Jinping hasn't said one way or another. What is your take on this?
I don't think Xi Jinping is going to go to Trump's inauguration for exactly the reason that you said. I think that for Xi Jinping to decide to go to Trump's inauguration, he would want to meet Trump, and he would want to have a clear idea already in advance of what they're going to discuss. I think that there's not going to be this. I mean, once upon a time, 10, 20 years ago, if the American president had invited the Chinese president to come and attend the US president's inauguration, relations between China and the United States in, say, 2004 were quite good. The Chinese president might have come. There might have been a friendly meeting. Now there are so many issues to talk about and discuss: trade, tariffs, American policy towards people in Western China. I want to use the word Western China, by the way, rather than these regions, but Western China, Taiwan, all of that. I think that there's so much that Xi Jinping will need to discuss with Trump. And he won't want to give the impression that he and Trump are friends and have some kind of understanding with each other before these things are properly and thoroughly discussed. So I think Xi Jinping will stay away. I mean, I'd be surprised if he went, actually. I think it would be uncharacteristic of the way Xi Jinping conducts diplomacy. When Xi Jinping went to Mar-a-Lago back in 2017, he didn't go by himself. There'd already been talks and discussions. Lots of people came with him. There was a detailed discussion between Trump and Xi Jinping, but there were all the various trade people and all of that there. And there was in effect a negotiation, which went well, by the way. It seems ages ago now. That's the only kind of meeting with Trump that I think Xi Jinping would want.
Yeah. Just to share with you some of when I had the live stream with my Chinese audience, and some people suggested that, well, Xi Jinping can go, and then Trump should invite Putin too, so they would have Yalta 2.0. That would be something, isn't it?
That would certainly be something. Well, it might even happen eventually. I mean, but we've got some distance to go before that does take place. So I think that both the Chinese and Russian leaders will want to prepare the ground very carefully before they meet with Trump. This isn't because they are, predisposed to be hostile to Trump. It's simply because for the moment, I don't think they feel that the ground has been prepared properly. And given how complex the situation is today, I think they will feel very, very reluctant to get drawn into discussions with Trump unless that ground has been prepared.
To deal with Trump is kind of a complex, as you said, because the other thing he said about China is somebody asked about the trade, right? Is Trump going to continue the trade war with China? And he had his Secretary of Commerce, he nominated somebody, and they were talking about the reciprocity. So, which I find very refreshing. Normally it's the Chinese who are talking about win-win situation. So this time they actually do talk about the reciprocity, and he's complaining that everybody, not just China, but other countries have high tariffs, but U.S. has very low or zero tariffs. He's saying that whatever you charge us, we're going to charge you. That sounds fair. I mean, in principle, he's a businessman. Maybe
Yeah.
in principle, that's what he has in mind. Is okay, okay, we do trade, we discuss about trade. But the problem with Trump is always, if you look at his cabinet, for example, the
Yeah.
people that he picked, right? The deep state, the people, including the people surrounding him, what are those people thinking and doing and influence on him, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that I wouldn't myself use the word fair. I think what Trump wants to do is he wants to drive a very, very hard bargain, putting China on the spot, getting the Chinese to make all kinds of trade concessions and all that kind of thing, and threatening them with very high tariffs if they don't. I mean, this is how he thinks. But there is one important difference between Trump and Biden, Clinton, Bush 1, Bush 2, every other American leader, which is that with Trump, this is all completely values neutral. I mean, he doesn't come along with all the moralizing, all the talk about human rights, all the meddling in Chinese internal affairs. That isn't, I mean, he isn't interested in any of that at all. And that, I think, is different. And I think that is something that China will welcome. I mean, I think the Chinese must be very, very tired of these tiresome lectures that they get from Western leaders. And the Biden administration has gone into them to an extreme degree. And so I think we're going to have all of that nonsense, because it is nonsense, finally put to one side. But I think Trump and these very hard-nosed people around him who have these very, very aggressive commercial and business instincts. I think what they want is a tough transactional, as they would say, negotiation with the Americans. When they talk about reciprocity, always be very careful, because reciprocity in Trump's world is one where the other side has to take reciprocal steps in order to satisfy the need, what he calls reciprocal steps, in order to satisfy the Americans. So, it might not be easy, it might not work, but at least it's more straightforward. And I think China will probably like that.
Yeah. Um, the other interesting conversation I thought is Tucker Carlson interviewed Jeffrey Sachs. And so one interesting fact, the acting South Korean president is Jeffrey Sachs' PhD student, apparently.
Yeah.
And then Jeffrey Sachs mentioned an article in that conversation. He mentioned the New York Times has an article talking about how the U.S. Army is preparing for war with China 2027. Yeah. Remember, we talked about 2027. Yeah. So it does seem like it's an interesting year. But so I looked it up. But why did he bring this up? He said that this article, after he read it, he sent a letter to the article's writer, which he didn't review, but the name is Helena Cooper. So apparently he contacted Helena Cooper and told her, okay, it's an interesting article. It's good we can read it now, because if it really happens, the war between US and China, we will be all dead. We won't even be able to read your article. Something like that. And then Helena apparently wrote back to him, telling him that when she was writing this article, there was a sentence that the editor, the New York Times editor, took it out 3 times. And the sentence was, the Pentagon isn't that interested in having a war with China. So I look at the article, and here is one paragraph. It's particularly interesting. It says, the Pentagon calls it the article's name is called The U.S. Army Prepares for War with China. Okay, that's the name of the article. And here it says, the Pentagon calls it a great power war, and it would be exponentially more dangerous. It would put the world's 2 strongest militaries, both of them nuclear superpowers, in direct conflict, possibly joining other nuclear adversaries, including North Korea and Russia. U.S. troops will be killed in numbers that would be possible go beyond the toll from America's deadliest conflicts. Now, if you read this paragraph, you will draw the conclusion. The natural conclusion is, for that reason, the Pentagon wouldn't want to get into a war with China, right? It's so the Pentagon take this very seriously. But that sentence, the conclusive, the most important sentence, which stated the Pentagon's position, is taken out. the editor took out that part.
Yes.
Isn't that despicable? I find that
well, it's very disturbing and very, very sinister, and it tells you exactly that there is a lobby in the United States that does want war with China. So the military doesn't. The military are preparing for a war because they've been told to, and the military follow orders. And that is very frightening and worrying in itself. But the military don't want war with China. They communicated the fact to this particular journalist, clearly, because she won't have made up something like that. But there's been editorial intervention to prevent the American people and the world knowing this. So somebody does want war with China, or at least wants China and the world to think that the United States wants war with China. I mean, it's one of the most frightening things, actually, that you can think of.
Yes, the many times when there's conflict between two parties, I think the audience, the cheerleaders, they are the dangerous people, right? They push the participants into a position that is very hard for them to reverse, right? And this is the New York Times. I just find
I know.
very disturbing.
And bear in mind, the New York Times is very close to the Biden administration. And I can't help but think that when the article was written and was sent to the editorial team, whoever it was within the New York Times consulted people within the administration. And there was a decision taken to take that sentence out, and repeatedly taken. And this was presumably done at the request of the administration itself. And at this level, a sentence like that decision must have been made at a very high level within the administration. I don't think that a junior official within the administration would have deleted on his or her own initiative a sentence saying that the Pentagon doesn't want war with China.
It's the key, the key sentence, right? Because that's the Pentagon's position on this matter.
Yes. So it looks as if this. I've long suspected that on the war in Ukraine, there is tension. There are tensions between the Pentagon and the administration. Now we can see that it's clear that there are tensions within the administration, between the administration and the Pentagon about war with China as well. And this is very important fact to know. It's important for two reasons. It shows that the outgoing administration was thinking about war with China. It also shows that the military in the United States recognizes the danger and doesn't want it.
Also, speaking about dangerous people, right? So in terms of the Syria and Middle East, if we come back here, I also read an article in the American Enterprise Institute by a guy called Michael Rubin, who supposedly to be a Middle East Forum observer. Okay. And the article's title is a giveaway. It's called "The United States Needs to Prepare to Kill Turks in Syria." And here it says, at the end of the article, it says, it may be diplomatically impolitic to say directly, but if Turkish-backed forces encourage terrorism and continue to pose threats to American forces countering the Islamic State in the region, it behooves the United States to begin a conversation about whether it may be necessary to target Turkish terror sponsors in the region. Turkey is a NATO member, but striking at its forces outside Turkey's boundaries would not trigger NATO's self-defense clauses, nor should there be outrage at such discussion, especially when Turkey's actions already cross the Rubicon and place American forces and interests in jeopardy. So I know, I think Trump, you said that Trump wants to stay out of it, right? But I'm not sure this is a think tank, right? American Enterprise is a think tank, influential think tanks. I'm not sure these people want to stay out of it. It sounds to me like they're not going to give a free ride and free hand for Turkey to do whatever they want in Syria.
Absolutely. Michael Rubin is absolute neocon royalty. He's one of the most powerful and long-standing neocons. So he is an extremely dangerous but also very influential and very, very powerful man. And it's very interesting reading what he is thinking. So he's already, I mean, there has been a neocon faction in the United States that's unhappy with Turkey altogether, and they've been unhappy with Erdogan altogether. And they've even been trying to foment regime change operations against him. John Bolton is one of them. So now we have Michael Rubin, who's more aligned with the Democrats, perhaps, than with John Bolton's group. But Michael Rubin comes on, and he's quite straightforwardly discussing war with Turkey. And he said, don't worry, they may be our allies, that they might be a NATO ally, but, we can still attack them, and it's perfectly fine. I mean, the idea that, because if you attack Turkey outside Turkey, that's somehow okay. It doesn't mean that the Turks themselves are not going to be fussed because they won't be able to invoke Article 5. I mean, it shows you the lunacy, the madness of these people. But you could see the direction that this is heading. And I find that very interesting, by the way, because it does look as if there are tensions between a section of the American establishment and Turkey after what happened in Syria. So after we finish this program, I'd be grateful if you could send me this article, because I wasn't aware of it, and I mean, I really do need to read it. But I mean, it does suggest that the crisis in Syria has only just begun, and that we're going to see a major battle for influence in Syria between Turkey on the one hand, Israel on the other. Israel, of course, backed by the United States. Michael Rubin is very, very strong supporter of Israel as well, by the way. And of course, the Kurds are historic allies, both of both of the United States, but also of Israel. So all of this needs to be thought about, and it's a very interesting article in that respect. Mad, but interesting.
Yeah. But that would be a catastrophe for the Syrian people, right? It would be
absolutely. But since when do neocons care about the fate of the people of the countries that they treat as part of a board game? I mean, it's all. I mean, this is all couched as looking after the Kurds, who are our allies. But don't worry about what happens to the Syrians. I mean, if Syria becomes a battleground for influence between the US and Turkey and Israel, don't expect any of the neocons to lose any sleep over the fact or worry about what this means for the Syrian people. They never care about that. That is one of the things that always horrifies me. It horrifies people in China too. They're more careful in the way they express themselves. But again, I mean, I get most of my understanding of Chinese foreign policy reading Global Times. I make no secret of this. And there, they do repeatedly talk about the humanitarian disasters that this kind of foreign policy causes. But in America itself, amongst these kind of people, that never features. They never think about that. I mean, it doesn't interest them. Jeffrey Sachs has made that point to me in public several times.
I also have a question. I always have this question. Now, so you see Ukraine trying so hard to get into NATO. I mean, why? I mean, what if you're inside the NATO? What if there are two NATO countries has conflict? For example, Greece and Turkey, they have a fight over Cyprus, for example. What happens then? What will NATO do if there is?
Well, it did. In 1974, I was in exile in London at that time, but I was already a teenager. I remember it very, very well. It looked as if Greece and Turkey were going to go to war over Cyprus. I mean, there were threats of Turkish intervention. The Greek army was being mobilized. All kinds of things were going on, and every so often we get aerial confrontations over the eastern Mediterranean Sea between the Greek Air Force and the Turkish. So this is not impossible. It might one day even happen. I don't know what NATO does. American policy until Erdogan came along tended to be to support Turkey against Greece because Turkey was seen as the more important country. Since Erdogan became president or leader of Turkey, they've tended to tilt more in favor of Greece. What I'm guessing they will do is that they will convene a meeting of NATO, demand an immediate ceasefire. If that doesn't happen, they will then say that whichever of the country it is that they are most unhappy with is committing aggression against the other, and they will then suspend it from NATO. Whether they would actually intervene militarily is, of course, unknown. I mean, this is a difficult situation to really imagine, but certainly it will be a major crisis within NATO if anything like that happened.
Which is, which means that if you are joining NATO, it's not really a guarantee of much of the things, right? And first of all, if you are in NATO, I mean, if you have a conflict with, for example, Russia, I'm not sure NATO will do much more than just giving weapons and stuff like that. And then secondly, NATO is enlarging, right? So they have right now 31 countries. And if they keep on enlarging, there will be just more and more countries join NATO. One day there will be countries within NATO will have conflicts. I mean, that will happen, right? And there's, in that case, then nothing, I mean, there's no guarantee whatsoever, right? It will be kind of like to fight it out.
In fact, I mean, you point to a number of very interesting points here. Firstly, about whether the NATO guarantee really is, really means anything. I'm going to tell you straight away. I mean, I used to know a few people in the military. Once upon a time, long ago, in a universe far away, I was a member of the Military and Naval Club in London, where I met many people who were from the military. Anyway, what I heard and what I heard from various Americans was that even during the Cold War, there was no possibility that the United States would risk its entire destruction in order to save Western Europe in the event that there was a Soviet attack. That if the Soviets attacked, the United States would resist for a while, but it would never go all the way up to an all-out nuclear exchange because it was not prepared to sacrifice its own existence to resist the Soviets. So already during the Cold War, in the corridors, not in the newspapers, but in the corridors, already it was discussed at that time that the American guarantee was not as strong as it appeared to be. And I think that has developed further since, in the sense that, let's say, Estonia got itself into trouble with Russia, and the Estonians did something utterly crazy, and the Russians responded. Again, the idea that the United States would risk its existence for Estonia or Moldova or whatever, I mean, I just don't believe it. I don't think anybody really believes in it either. So you're absolutely right. The more NATO expands, the less stable in that respect it becomes, the less its the more, the weaker its overall credibility is. I think for the moment, no one in Moscow is looking for a fight with NATO. But, if the balance of power shifts, if all kinds of things happen, then the Russians might decide to intervene somewhere because they might feel they have no choice. And at that point, the element of bluff that there is there will be called, in which case it's very difficult to see NATO survive. Now, your other point about conflicts between countries, there are conflicts all over NATO. To give one example, I was recently in Hungary, and relations between Hungary and Romania are extremely bad. There are territories inside Romania that Hungary traditionally considered Hungarian. The Hungarians told me that they have no claim on these territories and are not seeking to incorporate them in Hungary, but that they are very concerned about the treatment of the Hungarian people in these places by the Romanian government. Now, I'm not here to discuss the rights or wrongs of this quarrel. All I'm saying is that there are those tensions. There is conflict between these countries. So how do you avoid conflict? Well, you have them both in an alliance, but as you rightly say, it doesn't mean that because they're in the same alliance, that doesn't mean that they won't quarrel, and that quarrel might lead to a fight. So how do you avoid that? By, as the leader of the alliance, enforcing extremely high levels of bloc discipline, which means that you have to interfere constantly in the internal affairs of these countries to prevent them quarreling with each other, to prevent them doing things which you don't approve of. In effect, whether you like it or not, as the leader of the alliance, you are going to have to interfere continuously in their internal affairs. And if we come back to Hungary and Romania, there's recently been the cancellation of an election in Romania. That's not even correct. The annulment of an election result in Romania, because the person who looked like they were going to win the election, and by the way, the opinion polls showed that this man would have won overwhelmingly in the second round. I mean, he was heading towards a landslide. So this person not only wanted to keep Romania out of the conflict in Ukraine, but also he wanted to assert Romanian national interests, potentially against countries like Hungary. So you see, this is what you find yourself having to do. It's part of the burden, if you like, that an empire or a hegemon needs to carry. It's why hegemony is such a bad thing.
And I think the worst case it could be that the conflict, the two parties both think that NATO will be on their side, right? Then they will get emboldened, right, to make it worse.
You're absolutely correct about that. Also, I mean, so and by the way, this happened, as I very well remember, in Greece, between Greece and Turkey in the early 1970s, because at that time we had a military government in Greece, a dictatorship, which I, by the way, strongly opposed, but it was fervently pro-American and fervently pro-NATO. So one of the reasons for that crisis was precisely because the Greek military government took various decisions because they assumed that the Americans were going to support them, that NATO was going to support them, and that's why they staged a coup in Cyprus, which led to the whole crisis and the conflict which we are talking about. So absolutely, I mean, the fact that both sides are in NATO might very well encourage them to act in that kind of way. If we start to see quarrels of this kind surface in Europe, which is only a matter of time, by the way, then it will be a very strong sign that bloc discipline is starting to break down and that American power over its satellites is weakening.
Okay, I want to talk to you about Paul Wolfowitz, the Wolfowitz Doctrine. Before we do that, I just want to say that Paul Wolfowitz, doesn't he also a very typical, like a deep state person, very much like a Victoria Nuland, right? That Victoria Nuland is in and out of the State Department. Paul Wolfowitz was, in and out of the DOD, Department of Defense. None of them are really elected officials, but they are just always there, very influential to Secretary of State, to Secretary of Defense, and to the president. Isn't it? That it's just a very typical.
That is absolutely correct. I mean, Paul Wolfowitz was absolutely part of the permanent government of the United States. It didn't matter who was in the Oval Office. Paul Wolfowitz was always in power. And the Wolfowitz Doctrine, as you absolutely correctly said in the message you sent to me, still shapes American foreign policy to this day. Nothing's changed.
The reason I paid attention to this is the footage I sent to you, right, that Wesley Clark was talking about.
Yeah.
Most people familiar with what he was saying after 9/11, he went to the Pentagon and then saw the document about those 7 countries in the Middle East.
Yes.
But then later, he actually thought about it, and then he remembered he had encounter with Paul Wolfowitz in 1991 after Desert Storm. And that's when Wolf was saying, okay, first of all, he think they should go all the way, not just in and out of Iraq. That was a mistake. But also he said that, okay, we'll notice that the Soviet is not going to do anything. That means this is our opportunity to basically in control of the Middle East. And he said that before another superpower emerges. So that this Wolfowitz Doctrine, I think, started then. And then I think he wrote a paper, I think it's called the Defense Planning Guidelines, something, which is, I guess, formalized his idea, which is later be called the Wolfowitz Doctrine. And today, if we look back of what he was planning, like those 7 countries, which I think probably at the time, the most provocative thing about the Wolfowitz Doctrine from that document is preemptive strike. And I think September 11 almost, the people, not just him, but people who are with him who believe that, they use September 11 as a way to prove preemptive strike is needed, because they would say, you see, this is what happens when we don't do that. So that make this preemptive strike kind of normalized. People now accept that now. And then subsequently, they have the 7 countries. And the other thing in the document, also potential rivalries, they named Russia, Germany, and China. That was in the document as well. So you see, that's where we are today. And like you said, we're pretty much still living in that document, isn't it?
We are absolutely living in that document. I mean, I was aware that Wolfowitz had written a document in the early 90s in which he had said that the United States should work to prevent the emergence of another superpower rival. That now that the Soviet Union had exited the scene, it was essential for the United States to maintain indefinitely its global primacy. And I was aware that he'd said that. I was not aware that as early as 1991, he was already planning for the United States to rebuild and reshape and control the entire Middle East. That I did not know. But it doesn't surprise me. And of course, everything that we have seen since then basically follows from that. Because the neocons have a fixation with the Middle East. On the one hand, they've convinced themselves that the Middle East is some kind of pivot, that if they could control the Middle East, that will give the United States some kind of advantage over any conceivable rival superpower, be it China, Russia, or Germany. Nobody takes seriously the idea of Germany now, but Russia or China or any of those. So that's one reason. The other reason is, of course, the reason the neocons themselves never give, but it's always there. It's always deep down under the surface, which is that, of course, they want to do everything they possibly can to advance Israel's position in the Middle East. They see Israel as the indispensable and essential ally in the Middle East. They are very committed to the alliance with Israel. Many of them, I think, would describe themselves as Zionists, just to say, and they are therefore determined to see the destruction of all possible challenges to Israel within the Middle East as well. So that's never quite set out there in these documents, but it's always there, and it's they always frame reshaping of the Middle East in this sort of way as exclusively about American interests. But of course, they are also looking to defend Israeli interests, which they always insist are identical to American ones.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's never spelled out clearly, but like one of the things in the documents, it says, oh, another major U.S. objective should be safeguard U.S. interests and promote American values. Well, then subsequently we see color revolutions, Arab Springs happening in the Middle East, right? So it's very much in there, I think. So,
Yeah.
so that does it mean now they are all focusing on Iran now? Because the seven
Yes.
countries, more or less, they all happened, not exactly, happened the way they wanted,
No.
but they destroyed one country after another. Okay, they're fine with the chaos and people, getting killed and homeless
No.
and become refugees. They don't care any of that. That's fine. As long as they can get rid of the leaders they don't like, that's it. So
Yes.
now it seems like Iran is definitely the next, and possibly Turkey. I mean, they seems like have a pipeline of countries they want to destroy. So
Yes.
Turkey may be next. I don't know. What do you think?
Yes, it probably it presumably would be, but I do think that the next country they're going to target is Iran. There's already articles appearing about this. Now, Iran is a different society from any of the ones that we've talked about. It is a much more open politics. It is a much more powerful and sophisticated economy, even if it's been one that's been restricted by sanctions. It's got much more powerful armed forces. It's very, very much bigger. And in population terms, it's on a completely different scale with 90 million people. So it's a much, much more difficult country to take on in that way. But they will want to try and take on Iran. I think that is a real objective. And well, we'll see what they do.
Another thing is, since they talk about the Russia, Germany, that potential rivalries, I feel like there's always like this feeling about Germany is always a little bit put them on the edge a little bit. And so I wonder whether is it fair to say the Anglo-Saxon sphere, Britain, United States, they don't want to see Germany-Russia alliance. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, absolutely. They are always very, very suspicious in the end of Germany. Obviously, they fought world wars against Germany,
Uh-huh.
so I mean, bear in mind there is that history. But there's always a sense somehow that the Germans, um, they're pulled towards the West, but
Mhm.
their interests lie with the East. And there are many Germans, by the way, who historically have seen that. So if the Germans and the Russians come together and work together, historically, they've always been able to dominate Europe. I mean, when the Germans and the Russians came together, they defeated Napoleon, for example. When the Prussians and the Russians came together in 1870, Germany was united. When Hitler and Stalin agreed their non-aggression pact, Hitler was able to conquer the whole of Europe in just a few months. So I mean, just say, whenever Germany and Russia fall out, it's often very bad news for both of these countries. So there's always this desire to keep them divided from each other. In fact, there's that famous quote by Lord Ismay, who was the first Secretary General of NATO, who was once asked, "What is NATO?" And he said, "Well, what NATO is, what it's about is keeping the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down." I mean, it was that was what it was all supposed to be about. It's become even more complicated now because, of course, Russia is now aligned. They would say, I mean, remember, these are people who think in bloc terms.
Mhm.
Russia is now aligned with China. If Germany aligns with Russia, then it's by extension aligned with China as well. It's had long-standing economic connections with China. It trades with China quite a lot. It's done a lot of business with China, so that makes it even more dangerous. We can't have the Germans and the Russians coming together. We can't have the Germans and the Chinese coming together, and we absolutely can't have all three coming together, because that would be an absolute massive threat to us, and it would be the end of the world as we know it. Always remember what I said. At the end of it, at the base of it, today, China is always there at the root of their obsessions.
It drives them crazy, then.
Yeah. China does drive them crazy. First of all, because they're in awe of it. I mean, they sense when they deal with China that they're dealing with a civilization and a country that is immeasurably older than themselves. All Europeans have this to some extent. The Russians definitely have it. They're straightforward enough to admit that to me. So but they all have this sense of awe of China because of its size, the greatness of its civilization. They have that too. In the case of the Americans, there's a particular fear because they've never been up against an adversary like China before, one that is bigger, industrially stronger than they are, they're fully equal in technology. It's something that really, really makes them very nervous.
Now, I wonder whether that's the reason that, remember Russia trying to get into NATO, right? Several times they showed interest. Is that the reason they would never allow Russia to join NATO? Because that will provide opportunities for Russia and Germany to work together.
Absolutely. Absolutely, that's one of the main reasons. I mean, Russia altogether is just too big to be controlled. Russia inside NATO would open up potential for challenging the hegemony of the US, and that's something that the Americans would never allow. But the idea of Russia joining NATO and ganging up with Germany would be an American nightmare.
All right. Several countries' government are in trouble right now. Okay. So we start with the South Korea. Yoon is not resigning and he's now being impeached. But the South Korean system is different from the US. Even though he's impeached in the parliament, it's still up to the court to decide. So he's hanging there, which I think is worse. It's actually better that he's gone and then they can move on with whoever is the next leader, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's absolute nihilism. I mean, he's been impeached. He's lost the support of the parliament. He's been impeached by the parliament. He's lost the support of the people. His own defense minister, who was his main accomplice in the attempted coup, has attempted to commit suicide. And yet he clings on, says that he will remain president, prolongs this political crisis, denies the South Korean people to the opportunity to elect a president that they trust and believe in. As I said, he's continuing to destabilize South Korean society. And unfortunately, this gamble that he's playing could potentially pull off because the South Korean Supreme Court is, as you know, it's not up to strength. Apparently, it would require all 6 justices to support the impeachment ruling in order for the president to be forced to stand down. And that's not guaranteed.
Yeah. Well, Justin Trudeau, right, is also another government in disarray right now, but he's not planning to leave, even though Mr. Freeland is resigned. And there were, I think, a little bit earlier time, also some other minister also resigned. So he's kind of like and he's very unpopular, right? And so, but he's not leaving either, right?
No.
Canada. So what's going to happen with Canada? Just that they have to. Is he going to have a new kind of cabinet, and they just stuck with him?
I think for the moment they are stuck with him, but I'm also going to say that I think that we are now finally coming to the end of the Trudeau era. I mean, it's clear that Trump doesn't like him, and I think that probably has in some ways, in the end, worked against him. But he's deeply unpopular in Canada. We are now in that twilight situation in governments that have lost all credibility and authority when they cling on to office in the hope that something will happen. Nothing ever does. Everything decays and falls apart around them. Eventually, they leave office and are completely discredited. And in the meantime, the situation in the country has been worsened even more. Britain has just been through exactly the same process, where the Conservative government lived out much longer than it really deserved to. And exactly the same thing is happening in Canada now. In Canada, it's going to be worse.
And France, and another country, because right now I think they're third or the fourth prime minister now for this year alone. So again, Macron is now leaving, and it seems like it's going to be a kind of chaotic government as well, right?
Yes. Well, you're absolutely correct about this, because the root of the political crisis in France is that Macron insists on remaining president and insists on his own policies being implemented, even as these are being rejected by the French people. So we've had a European Parliament election in which his party was completely defeated. We had a parliamentary election in France itself, which Macron insisted on calling. He was advised not to, but he just went ahead and did it anyway because he thought incredibly that his party would win. And he did badly. So he's got no majority for his policies, but he insists that they must be implemented. So in a way, it's not that different from the South Korean president and from Trudeau in Canada, in the sense that a president who has exhausted the patience of his people continues to insist that he must not only be in power, but must continue to exercise power, even as everything collapses around him. And there is ever deeper unpopularity.
The system, though, is kind of interesting. All these countries, and in Germany already collapsed, right? So they're waiting for election next year.
Yes.
So all these situations, they all seems like the president or the prime minister has a serious problem with the parliament, that they cannot work with their parliament effectively. And why is that? And it seems like there's no good way to correct that, right?
No, there is no good way, because what we have in the West is that we've, for quite a long time now, had a breakdown in the kind of politics that we used to have in Europe and in the United States. The post-Second World War model in Europe and the United States was that you had always in any country, two political blocs. One was right, basically anchored on the middle class, supporting the business community, supporting, capitalism or capitalistic policies, seeking low taxes or lower taxes. And the other was a left-wing alternative, which sometimes described itself as socialist or social democratic, not always, but was anchored on labor unions, supported some elements of redistribution, believed in a more active role for the government in the economy. Anyway, this was the difference, and they alternated with each other. So there was never revolutionary change. The West always followed an essentially capitalist liberal model, but there were significant differences between the political groups, and people could identify with them, and they could vote for them in the genuine belief that if they voted for one party, it would do things differently from the way the other party did. Well, sometime around 1995 or so, this system broke down. And what we have instead is a centrist model that has been, center is a loaded word, a neoliberal model that has been imposed, which all of the parties, left and right, all adhere to, which essentially have the same set of policies on economics, on immigration, on social issues, on welfare issues, and on foreign policy, and which they insist is the only way forward. And anybody who's dissents from this is called a populist, is the subject of media campaigns, will be investigated by the intelligence services, or all of that kind of thing. So you gather power at a kind of neoliberal center, Atlanticist center. But what that has done is that it's taken legitimacy and new thinking and political credibility out of the system, because especially as the system fails to deliver effective economic and social policies that really address the problems that exist in society, dissatisfaction grows, but the center insists that it and only it can retain control. And the result is increasing instability, because people are angry, people are dissatisfied, they sense the problems are piling up and that the center cannot actually do things. This is a good way of seeing the fallacy, if you like, that liberal Western parliamentary democracy is the only mechanism for conducting democracy. Because in other countries, and I can come back to China, there is an awful lot more debate and discussion and ideas circulating in the system, because the system facilitates them. Whereas in the West today, they are preventing alternative ideas from taking root there.
Yeah, just as a voter, in the US, I find I don't have anybody representing me right now.
No.
So,
No.
I mean, I ended up voting for the third party, but I know that third party does not have a chance for winning.
Yes.
And so the result of that, I don't think I'm alone. So there is people kind of like in the disarray in the sense, because there's no real good representatives for the people.
Yes.
And that lead to this chaos, I guess, in the parliament versus the leader, the president and the prime minister. Okay.
Yes. I mean, there is the very famous poem by Yeats about the center cannot hold. And one of the big mistakes we always make in the West, in my opinion, is that we always see the right way in politics, the correct way to follow what is called the moderate center. The center is never very moderate, certainly not at the moment. And on the contrary, it's very aggressive and very entitled. And its insistence on retaining control is causing major disturbance in the system. There's no obvious way how to break out of this, because there is no ideological challenge to it. Nobody is saying we have got to look at the entire legal, constitutional, parliamentary model. That is impossible to do.
And I also find that some of the description, even the words, the definition is kind of like confusing. So nowadays, the AfD in Germany is regarded as far right. Okay, Orban in Hungary is regarded as far right. But if you listen to them carefully, I don't find them. And the other is in France, right? That they have some far right. What is her name? But I just don't see, if you listen to them, they are more like centered to their own country. Like they want to do what's the most, that makes sense to them to improve and advance the country's agenda. I don't find that far right, but that the mainstream characterize it, define all these people as far right, right?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Because of course, in Europe and to some extent in the United States, the expression far right, which is a label, it is meaningless in contemporary politics, but it's a label that's attached to various parties, and it really sends a signal that the person who calls these parties far right believes these people are really fascists. It's a way of using the expression fascist, of pointing and insinuating that these people are fascist without simply saying so. It's called, what we call a dog whistle. It's the dog whistle language. It And of course, you're absolutely correct, because when you actually look at the policies of these parties. Now, I was, again, recently in Hungary. If you went back to the Europe of the 1960s, Western Europe of the 1960s, in a time machine, and you visited countries like Sweden at that time, you would have found very similar policies to the policies that are being followed in Hungary today. Sweden first, keeps outside alliances, pursues an independent foreign policy, has strong intervention in the economy, government intervention in the economy, has a very strong welfare model, doesn't like immigration very much. The heyday of social democracy in Sweden in the 1960s, under someone like Tage Erlander, you would have seemed very familiar to someone who has just gone there after living some time in Viktor Orban's Hungary. And that was, by the way, pointed out to me by someone in Hungary who supports Orban while I was there, that the Hungarian system is actually very close to traditional Western social democracy. But of course, because it's outside the neoliberal consensus, you call it far right, and you insinuate that Orban is really a fascist.
Yeah. Yeah, in France, it's Le Pen, right? Okay, I remember that.
Le Pen is a fascist, and Fico in Slovakia, who straightforwardly says that he is left. He's a fascist too. All of these people are fascists.
Coming back to the US, again, it never feels the transition is this long. So one thing Biden did is pardoned clemency, giving clemency to 1,500 people. He might even continue to give more. But so far, some of the people are really awful. They are horrible people. Just two examples. So there's this woman's name, Amira Shadiva. She is supposed to be a cancer doctor, but she diluted the cancer drugs to make money. How awful is that? And she got the clemency. Another one is Michael Conahan, another judge, a judge. He's taking bribes to send children to prison in order for, to help the prison industry complex. And as a result of that, some of those children, they're so distressed in the prison, they kill themselves. There were several of those cases. Why is Biden totally crazy now? Why is he doing these things? I mean, what does he get out of it?
No, what he's doing is preparing the ground for these blanket pardons that I think he's intending, and the people around him are intending to issue in a few weeks' time, probably just before he leaves the White House, in which he's going to pardon all sorts of people. Apparently hundreds and hundreds of them who've been in the government and the Democratic Party of crimes that they haven't even yet been accused of, let alone investigated or prosecuted for. So he's already expanding the use of the pardon power to prepare us all for this. He starts with his son. He then uses the pardon power in this completely indiscriminate way. He clearly hasn't. I mean, they're not interested in looking at the cases in any detail. So they're not really bothered about whom they pardon, but they want us to get accustomed to the idea of mass pardons. And then they will go a step forward and they will pardon people of crime in advance of any trial or prosecution or that kind of thing. It is a grotesque, corrupt abuse of the pardon power. I mean, it is. I personally think, I'm not an American and I'm not an American lawyer, but I personally think that this is unconstitutional. I think this is so completely contrary to the purpose of the pardon power as set out in the Constitution that I think that this is unconstitutional. And I'm not personally convinced that these pardons are really enforceable. I mean, if we're talking about the pardons that we hear about, which will be granted, which will pardon people who may have committed crimes, but we don't know whether they have been committed crimes, but who haven't even been investigated or accused of any crimes, basically to prevent investigations of them. Well, all I will say about that is that the nature of a pardon is that you are pardoned for a crime you have committed. If nobody even knows that you've committed a crime, how can you be pardoned of it? It makes absolutely no sense. The pardon power that the president has, in my opinion, is another of the things that the framers of the Constitution took from English practice. In England, the king always had the power to pardon people. It was always very, very conservatively exercised, and it was always used after the event, and it was done basically to check as a check on the on miscarriages by the courts, based on the fact that the king was himself the ultimate judge. I mean, within the English legal concept, the ultimate judge is still the king. I mean, the judges exercise their power as judges through power delegated to them by the king, who is the supreme judge. That's the English legal theory. Now, I think this has never really worked quite as well in the American system, but I think the way that it is being used now for nakedly political purposes is incredible. And in England, the only time I can think of when the king exercised power so abusively was in the 17th century, when the then king James I pardoned his favourite, the Earl of Essex, after the Earl of Essex had been convicted of and had confessed to a murder where he murdered someone by poison. And the king did that. And this created a huge political crisis in England at the time. And the king's reputation, the king being James I, never recovered. So I personally think this is unconstitutional.
Yes, I have that question because I think there's a difference between pardon and immunity, right? That what he's giving is not pardon, but immunity. There were even people ask,
That's a very good way of putting it, by the way. Yeah.
Because there are people even asking this question, like, okay, he gave Hunter Biden this 11 years, like a pardon. What if we later find out in 2015 that he committed murder, for example?
Yeah.
And he just get away with that?
Well, exactly. Right? That is exactly correct. I mean, I don't think it is possible in any legal system to pardon someone of an offence that no one, apart from the person who's been pardoned, knows has yet been committed. So if we discover, as you correctly say, that Hunter Biden killed someone, which is not impossible. I mean, it's not saying he did that, but let's assume that such a thing happened. You can't say in that kind of situation that he can't be investigated or charged. That makes no sense to me.
One more thing is that we are witnessing the downfall of the mainstream. So a big event is, of course, ABC agrees to pay Trump Library, I guess, $15 million for defamation. So they settled outside court, and plus $1 million for his legal fees. Of course, there's all all kinds of people saying, "Oh, how horrible that is," because now everybody got intimidated,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. But I have to say, when I look at that interview, that the case that really angered Trump apparently and filed the lawsuit.
Yeah.
I do think they lied about what happened. They said
Yeah.
George Stephanopoulos said that Trump was fined, I think liable for rape, which
Yeah.
really was saying is that liable for sexual abuse, which is totally
Yes.
different.
Yes.
And so it's I think ABC was lying. So there's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with that.
No.
And Trump have said that now he's going to file another lawsuit against the CBS. So remember, CBS had this interview with Kamala Harris, which they later edited the answer to her
Yeah.
questions because it was so bad. Now, in Trump's view, you interrupted the election,
Yes.
disruption of the election, which I think is fair, which
Yes.
that is because
Yes.
she is a candidate, right? So,
Yeah.
I personally think it could be a good thing for the mainstream media to be a little bit mindful about telling the truth. What do you
Yes.
think?
I completely agree with you. I think this is long overdue, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, I am a strong supporter of the First Amendment, but I
Mhm.
really do think that there has been so much defamation, so much lying and outright slander, and it's been used in such a destructive and cruel way that it's time that it was brought to a stop. And what all this lying has done is it's polluted the political debate in the United States, but it has also severely undermined, in exactly the way that you say, the credibility of the media. The media are careful what they say. If they start conducting editorial control properly, then people will start paying attention to them again.
Well, the latest one, CNN, did you see that reporter totally
Mm.
faked that there is a prison? Some prisoner was in the prison that they discovered
Yeah.
by
In
chance or
Syria.
something.
Yeah.
In Syria, yeah, that somehow
Yeah.
that he was in there for 3 months, but later turns out he's some kind of a military person, or so I
Yeah.
saw somewhere even saying he's kind of a spy, even for the British spy or something. I don't know exactly
Yeah,
who
no.
he is, but he certainly is not the prison that being in prison for three
Yes.
months.
Yes.
That's
I know, absolutely. I mean, the whole thing was completely fake, and needs to be. And again, I mean, uh, if that story had been properly researched, that would have immediately come to light. But of course, nobody did research it.
and when that was circulating in the Chinese social media, so lots of people
Yeah.
remember. So another CNN story about the so-called Xinjiang, that they interviewed this guy who claimed to be a escaped camp, a guard
Yeah.
that escaped from Xinjiang, one of those so-called camps. And what's funny was the whole thing is that if you have any common sense, if you know anything about Chinese character, on his arm there was a tag there supposedly to write police, in Chinese. But those two words were wrongly. It's like a misspell of those two police. It was, it,
Well,
it was,
that's extremely funny. It's so interesting that it's the first time I've ever heard about the story is just now. I can tell you for an absolute fact that no media um, agency in the West has ever mentioned that. That is hilarious, actually. I mean, I have to say the case from China
Mhm.
that still upsets me was the one about the tennis player. When all sorts of
Yeah.
stories were spread about her, she repeatedly denied them. And they went on repeating them despite her denials. And I mean, that was so terrible.
Yeah, for me, the turning point is 2019 about the Hong Kong.
Yeah,
What they reported about Hong Kong. And by the
yeah,
way, Nancy Pelosi recently fell right in somewhere in Europe. Um, you know what people are saying in China? Nancy Pelosi probably is the most hated American in China.
Oh, really? I didn't know.
Yeah, because in Hong Kong during that time, she's the one who said, "Oh, that's a beautiful sight to behold." Now that has become a phrase that every time something bad happened to her, people would say, "Oh, that's a beautiful sight to behold." Now, why does people have so much anger towards her? I personally can't stand her.
Mm,
Um, I was in Hong Kong in 2019,
mm,
and I was staying in a hotel. And during the evening time, so I came down to the lobby, going out for dinner with my son. The people in the hotel actually was waiting for us in the lobby. They told us, they said, well, they are coming. And I kind of like, who are they, right? So the people in the hotel, they referring to those so-called freedom fighters, those students, as they, because those people are very violent. They are definitely not peacefully protesting. They were very violent. What happened was my hotel was next to a park, a big park, and those people are supposedly they are taking the train to come to that park to so-called protest. But along the way, they were actually vandalizing the train. They were doing that, and and that's why even the locals were simply horrified by these
Yeah.
people. So that's
Yeah.
why they were telling us, they are coming, and they were vandalizing the train, they were vandalizing stores, they were doing all kinds of, they even set fire on an older man because the man was saying, you guys shouldn't be so violent. It took on the tape. It was on the tape. Everybody could see
Yeah.
it.
I
And
seem to remember that actually.
yeah, and
I
yet
remember seeing some pretty awful things, but I never. Gosh. Yeah, anyway, carry on.
she's calling these people freedom fighters, democracy fighters, and a beautiful sight to behold. I mean,
Yeah.
people are downright angry with this kind of attitude.
Yes. Yes.
Now, I saw that there is an article from Voice of America. They're saying, no, 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 she didn't say that she's concurring to those kind of behavior. She's saying those peaceful, protests, those are the beautiful side to behold. Well, but she herself never came out, never
No.
condemned all those violent behavior
No.
whatsoever.
No. I agree. I agree with that completely. I mean, the Westerners never see violence when it's perpetrated by people who are promoting what you might call Western values. In
Yeah.
other words, sorry, Western agendas. It's a terrible truth.
And they finally, I mean, take no pleasure for an older woman, fell apparently very serious. She had a surgery,
Yeah.
right? But just so you know, the sentiment in China, the netizens, and she's
Mm.
deeply corrupted. Her son, I just find out,
Yeah.
he's holding some Chinese telecom companies stocks, a lot of
Gosh.
them. So, so while she was visiting Taiwan, her
Yeah.
son was doing some business dealings, etc.,
Yeah.
etc. And it just the
No, I
next
know.
to the
I know.
Biden family is the Pelosi family. Let's put
Pelosi
it that
family. Yeah.
way. Yeah.
I have to say, it doesn't. I didn't know any of this, but it doesn't surprise me.
I mean, Nancy Pelosi is very famous, right? Because people just simply can't stand her. So there's a lot of reporting
Well,
just that.
I have to say, I didn't know any of these things, and I couldn't stand her. I find her extremely pretentious
Mhm.
and annoying, and at the same time very manipulative. A very manipulative individual altogether. So I never liked her. I'd heard about her corruption. I didn't know about these things that you've
Yeah,
just told me.
hers.
These things you've told me today. Mm.
Well, what happened with her son, Paul
Yeah.
Pelosi Jr., I think it's actually even reported in the Daily Mail about
Right. Yeah.
his
Yes.
business dealings, yeah, with China.
Yes. Yes.
Anyway, so I think that's conclude what I want to talk to you today. It's just
Yes.
another very busy week with all kinds of dramas
Very
everywhere.
busy week. Thank you
Okay,
very much, Sophia. Great to speak to you again.
bye.
Bye.